Have you ever left a project management meeting thinking, I understand every word, but I still don't know what they meant? A member of our community recently asked me one of the best questions I've received. How do I become fluent in the way project managers actually speak? That's such a great question because most people assume experienced project managers simply know more business jargon. But after more than a decade leading enterprise projects, I've learned something completely different. Project managers don't communicate differently because they know bigger words. No, they communicate differently because they've learned to think differently. And by the end of this episode, you'll never hear the word bandwidth the same way again. Picture this. It's your second week as a project manager. You walk into the conference room a few minutes early, notebook in hand, excited because this is exactly the opportunity you've been working towards. One by one, people begin filling into the room. Someone from finance sits across you. The engineer manager pulls out a laptop. The director joins the call remotely. Everyone exchanges a few quick greetings and then the meeting begins. At first, you're feeling pretty good. You recognize the project. You understand the agenda. You think, well, I've got this. But within a few minutes, the conversation changes. Someone says, we don't have the bandwidth to support that request this quarter. Another person responds, if we move forward, we'll have to revisit our dependencies because the business value doesn't justify the risk. Then someone else jumps in and says, let's socialize this with the stakeholders before we commit to a mitigation strategy. You quietly write every phrase down in your book. Bandwidth, dependencies, business value, mitigation strategy, stakeholder alignment. You recognize every word individually, but when you put them together, it feels like they're speaking a language nobody taught you. You smile. You even nod. You even convince everyone around you that you're following the conversation, but inside, you're thinking, what in the world did they just say? Therefore, you leave the meeting doing what every new project manager does. You go home. You open your laptop. You start searching for definitions. I know that feeling because I've lived it. There was a time when I thought experienced project managers were just simply smarter than I was. I thought they had memorized thousands of business terms I've never heard before. But after leading enterprise projects for more than a decade, I realized something that completely changed the way I looked at project management. They weren't communicating with bigger words. They were communicating with better thinking. Here's a reflection, family. Looking back, I don't think I was confused because I didn't understand project management. I was confused because I was listening to the words instead of listening to what those words were trying to accomplish. Think about it. When an experienced project manager says, we don't have the bandwidth, they're usually not talking about people being busy. They're communicating capacity, priorities, trade-offs, risk, and sometimes even budget. One simple sentence, they're helping everyone in the room understand why a decision may need to change. That's why project management language feels so intimidating when you're first starting out. You think you're learning vocabulary, but you're actually learning how experienced professionals think through problems. Once I understood that, I just stopped trying to memorize project management phrases. Instead, I started asking myself a different question. What decision is this person trying to help the team make? And that amazing thing was I started listening in a different way. That language finally began to make sense. So what separates someone who knows project management from someone who sounds like they've actually led projects? Principle number one, professional language exists to create clarity, not complexity. Ooh, I like that, family, because professional language exists to create clarity, not complexity. One of the biggest misconceptions I had early in my career was believing that experienced project managers use business language to just sound more professional. Looking back, I could have been more wrong. Every phrase I heard in those meetings had a purpose. It wasn't to impress people or impress upon people. It was here to help everyone in the room reach the same understanding as quickly as possible. That's why experienced project managers don't choose words based on how sophisticated they sound. They choose words based on how effectively those words communicate the situation, reduce ambiguity, and help, and I do mean help, people make better decisions. Here's the lesson, family. Think about one of the most common phrases you'll hear in project management. Let's use, we don't have the bandwidth. When you're new to project management, it sounds like another corporate buzzword, but an experienced project manager usually isn't saying the team is simply busy. They're communicating something much bigger. They're saying the team's current capacity doesn't align with the work being requested. There are competing priorities. There are resource limitations. They may be budget constraints, timeline constraints, or even skill constraints that prevent the team from taking on additional work without increasing delivery risk. For example, instead of saying we have a resource problem, I might say the team's bandwidth isn't compatible with taking on this initiative right now. Our primary constraint is budget, so my recommendation is to phase the implementation and deliver the highest business value first. You notice what just happened there? I didn't just communicate the problem. I communicated the constraint, the reason behind it, and the recommendation for moving forward. That's why project managers use this language. It creates clarity. Here's 2 actionable tips I love for you to experiment with. Tip number 1, listen for the decision. Again, listen for the decision, not just the words. The next time you're in a meeting and someone uses a phrase like bandwidth, dependency, or business value, I want you to ask yourself, what decision is this person trying to help the team make? That one question will teach more than memorized definitions ever will. Tip number 2, explain before you summarize. When you're communicating with your team, don't stop at conclusion. Instead of saying, we don't have the bandwidth, briefly explain, for example, the team is fully committed to 2 critical deliverables this sprint. So taking on this request would put both timelines at risk. People trust communication they actually understand. Here's my professional advice, family. One of the habits that separates experienced project managers from new project managers isn't a bigger vocabulary. It's intentional communication. Great project managers don't use business language to sound important. They use it because every phrase reduces uncertainty, creates alignment, and helps people make informed decisions. Always remember this. Your goal isn't to sound like a project manager. Your goal is to communicate so clearly that people trust your judgment. Now, here's what's interesting. Once I realized professional language wasn't about sounding smarter, another question immediately came to my mind. If those words are really communication decisions, then how do experienced project managers know which words to choose in the first place? Principle number 2, how experienced project managers think. Professional language is a reflection of professional thinking. Oh, I like that, family. See, one of the biggest shifts in my career happened when I stopped focusing on finding the right words and started focus on understanding the situation. Experienced project managers don't pause in the middle of a meeting wondering, which corporate phrase sounds the most impressive? They first identify what it actually happened. Only then do they choose the language that best communicates the decision, the risk, or the recommendation. In other words, the thinking comes first, the words simply follow. Here's a lesson, family. Let's go back to the phrase, we don't have bandwidth. Notice something interesting? A new project manager hears that and immediately thinks everyone is busy. An experienced project manager hears something completely different. They begin asking questions. What work is currently consuming the team capacity? Is it constraint people, budget, timing, or specialized risk? Can priorities be adjusted? Can scope be reduced? Can the work be delivered in phases? Can additional resources be brought in? The phrase bandwidth isn't the answer. It's the beginning of the conversation. That's why experienced project managers often sound so confident. They aren't reacting to words. They're analyzing the situation behind the words. Experiment with these actionable tips. Tip number 1, practice identifying the real constraint. Next time someone presents a problem, resist the urge to jump straight into a solution. Instead, ask yourself, what is actually preventing this project from moving forward? The clearer you become at identifying the real constraint, the more natural your communication will actually improve. Tip number 2, lead with the situation before the solution. Instead of saying, we need to delay this project, try saying, because of our testing environment won't be available to next week, I recommend moving the release by 5 business days to reduce implementation risk. Notice how the recommendation was the context? That's exactly how experienced project managers build trust. Here's my professional advice, family. One of the fastest ways to improve your communication isn't learning more project management terminology. It's becoming better at diagnosing problems. The more clearly you understand what is happening, the more naturally you choose language that helps everyone else understand it too. That's why That's why exceptional project managers rarely sound rehearsed. They're spending They're not doing that. They're responding to situation, not reciting business phrases they've already memorized. Because there's still one question we haven't answered yet. If professional language comes from the way experienced project managers think, how do you develop that kind of thinking before you have the years of experience? I'm glad you asked that because that question changed the way I approach every meeting, every project, every conversation. And that's exactly what we'll talk about in the next principle. Principle number 3, how can you develop that way of thinking? I like that, family, because fluency is built through intentional observation and not memorization. One of the biggest mistakes I made early in my career was believing I needed to memorize the language of project management. Well, actually looking back now, I wasn't trying to become fluent. As I told you, I was trying to become impressive. Those are two completely different goals. Fluency doesn't happen because you memorize more words. It happens because you spend enough time absorbing how experienced professionals think, ask questions, make decisions, and communicate under pressure. And the biggest one is really communicating under pressure because eventually the language stops feeling borrowed. It actually starts feeling a little, natural. Here's the lesson, family. Think about how we learned our first language. Most of us didn't learn it by memorizing a dictionary. We learned it by listening, by observing, by asking questions, by making mistakes, by hearing the same words in different situations until it finally, it actually just started becoming a part of us. Project management worked the same way. The more meetings you participate in, the more executive emails you read, the more status updates you write, the more you listen to experienced project managers explain risk, negotiate priorities, and communicate recommendations, the more you begin to recognize patterns. Eventually, you'll notice something surprising. You're no longer translating the conversation in your head, you're actually participating in it. And that's when fluency begins. Here's 2 actual tips I'd love for you to experiment with. Build your own translation guide. Keep a notebook or a digital document where you write down phrases you hear in meetings. Next to each phrase, don't just write definition. Write the situation. Write the decision that was being made. Write why the phrase was the best choice in the moment. Over time, you'll build a resource that's far more valuable than a list of vocabulary words. Tip number 2, practice translating conversation. After your next meeting, ask these 3 simple questions. What was the biggest decision we made? What language helped us reach that decision? And how would I explain that same conversation to someone who wasn't in the room? Again, what was the biggest decision we made? What language helped us reach that decision? And how would I explain that same conversation to someone who wasn't in the room? See, that simple exercise will strengthen your professional communication faster than memorizing another list of business terms. Here's my professional advice, family. Here is something I wish someone had told me years ago. Don't measure your progress by how many project management phrases you know. Measure your progress by how clearly you can explain a project, a risk, or recommendation to someone. Because clarity is the true sign of fluency, and the best project managers aren't remembered for having the biggest vocabulary. They're remembered for helping people understand complicated situations with confidence and simplicity. So, after more than a decade of leading projects, here's the question I want to leave you with. What if becoming fluent in project management was never about learning a new language? What if it was always about learning a new way to think? Here's my reflection, family. When we first walked into a meeting together, I probably felt like everyone else was speaking a language somehow I missed. But after today's conversation, I hope you see it a little different. Project managers don't communicate differently because they're trying to sound more intelligent. They communicate differently because they're trying to create clarity. Every phase, every question, every recommendation is helping people understand a situation, reduce uncertainty, and make better decisions. For the longest time, I thought becoming fluent meant memorizing more project management terminology. Looking back, I realized it wasn't trying to become fluent. I was trying to become impressive. There are 2 completely different goals. Real fluency isn't measured by how many business terms you know. It's measured by how clearly you can explain a project, communicate a risk, recommend a solution, and help people move forward together. So next time you walk into a meeting and hear someone talk about bandwidth, dependency, business value, or stakeholder alignment, don't ask yourself, what does that word mean? Instead, ask yourself, what decision is this person trying to help the team make? Because once you start listening that way, the language finally begins to make sense. Here's my close, family. This is the very first episode of the Project Management Translation Guide, and we're just actually really getting started here. In our next episode, we'll translate another phrase you hear in everyday project management and uncover what experienced leaders are actually communicating. The goal is to become the kind of leader people trust when conversation matters most. And if you're ready to move beyond certifications and build real-world confidence, the Project Management Lab exists to help project managers replace uncertainty with confidence. I've included some resources in the description to help you continue building that project manager you want to become. And remember, sets and reps beat talent when talent doesn't do the reps. If you're new to the episode, I go by the name of ED. For all you smart and intelligent folks out there, hey, listen, that just simply means Ed. Until next time.